In 2014, a team of psychologists walked into dozens of Starbucks cafes across China and did something strange. They moved chairs to block the aisles. Then they sat back and watched what people did. In northern China, the wheat belt, customers walked up, grabbed the chair and shoved it aside. Problem solved. My path, my rules. But in southern China, the rice belt, something different happened. People turned sideways. They squeezed through the gap. They adapted themselves to the obstacle rather than forcing the obstacle to move. Same country, same coffee shop, completely different instincts. And the reason has nothing to do with education, income, or personality. It has everything to do with a single plant that has been quietly programming the human mind for 9,000 years. This is the story of how rice engineered China, not the other way around. How a broken, defective seed hijacked an empire, carved mountains into staircases, held up the Great Wall through earthquakes, and hardwired a psychological blueprint into the brains of over 1 billion people. 1. The genetic misfit that changed everything. To understand how we got to that Starbucks, we need to go back roughly 10,000 years, to the floodplains of the Yangtze River. There are no kings yet, no bronze tools, no written language, just mud, water, and wild grass taller than a person. You are a forager, wading through knee-deep water, surrounded by thousands of rice stalks. You reach out to grab a handful of grain, and it is gone. The seeds have already snapped off and buried themselves in the mud. This is a built-in survival mechanism called shattering. Wild rice, Oryza rufipogon, has an escape plan encoded into its DNA. When the seed ripens, a tiny layer of cells called the abscission zone dissolves automatically. The seed drops, plants itself, and avoids being eaten. From the plant's perspective, this is genius engineering. From your perspective, standing hungry in a swamp, it is a nightmare. But nature is not perfect. In every generation of wild rice, a few plants were born with a defect. A single mutation at what scientists now call the SH4 gene disrupted the abscission layer. These mutant stalks held onto their grain. They refused to let go. In the wild, these plants were evolutionary failures. They could not self-seed, could not spread, and were destined to disappear. But somebody noticed them. Archaeological evidence from the Shangshan culture in Zhejiang province tells us what happened next. Foragers began wading through the swamps, ignoring the thousands of normal stalks, and specifically targeting these stubborn, broken plants that were still clutching their seeds. They used simple stone flakes and finger knives, tools perfectly shaped for snipping individual seed heads off the top of the stalk. They took those seeds home, and the next year they planted them. This is an extraordinary moment in human history, and it deserves more attention than it gets. Without microscopes, without any concept of genetics, these Neolithic foragers were conducting the world's first open-air gene editing. Today, scientists use CRISPR technology in sterile laboratories to alter crop DNA. 9,000 years ago, anonymous farmers in a muddy swamp were doing functionally the same thing, selecting for a single genetic trait, generation after generation, until it became dominant. Micro-CT scans of pottery fragments from Shangshan, some of the oldest ceramics ever found, reveal rice husks mixed into the clay, and a significant percentage of those husks already show the non-shattering trait. These people were not just eating rice, they were engineering it. Here is what most people get wrong about this story. We say humans discovered rice. That is not accurate. We rescued a genetic defect. We took the rejects, the plants that were failing at being wild, and gave them a new purpose. Rice did not choose us. We chose the mistakes. But having a seed that stays on the stalk is only half the problem. If weeds choke your entire field before the grain ripens, you have nothing. And weeds in the subtropical Yangtze were relentless. To protect their new treasure, these ancient farmers needed a weapon. They found one hiding in plain sight. 2. The drowning field. Ask most people why rice grows in water, and they will tell you it is a thirsty plant. That is a myth. Rice grows perfectly well on dry land. In fact, upland rice varieties have been cultivated on dry hillsides across Southeast Asia for thousands of years. So why did Chinese farmers flood their fields? Because water is a weapon. Rice possesses a trait that almost no other grain crop has. a sophisticated internal tissue called parenchyma. Think of it as a built-in snorkel system. Inside the stems and roots of a rice plant are large, interconnected, hollow channels. These tubes transport oxygen from the air above the waterline straight down into the roots, even when the bottom of the plant is completely buried in suffocating anaerobic mud. When you flood a rice field with a few inches of water, you are launching biological warfare. Every competing weed and grass, plants that would normally steal sunlight, water, and nutrients, suffocates. They do not have the snorkel. They cannot breathe underwater. They die. But the rice stands there, breathing perfectly fine, growing without competition. This is why a rice paddy was never just a muddy field. It was a precision-engineered, water-powered weed-killing machine. And here is what makes this even more remarkable in context. While farmers in Mesopotamia and later in medieval Europe were spending back-breaking days pulling weeds by hand from their dry wheat and barley fields, Chinese farmers had invented the world's first automated pest control. They built complex networks of earthen bunds, dikes, and wooden sluice gates. A single person could lift a gate, let the river rush in, and drown every weed in the field in a matter of hours. There is an important detail buried in the Chinese historical record that most Western accounts miss entirely. The Zhuozhuan, one of the oldest narrative histories in China, compiled around the 4th century BC, records disputes between neighboring states over water rights for irrigation. These were not minor disagreements, they were causes for war. Control of the waterways that fed the paddies was quite literally a matter of national survival. Whoever controlled the water controlled the food. Whoever controlled the food controlled the empire. But this brilliant drowning machine had a hidden cost. Flooding and draining the same field year after year slowly washes away the nutrients that plants need to grow. The soil gets exhausted, a growing population demanded more and more grain, and the land was running out of fuel. The answer had been floating on the surface of every rice paddy all along. It just took someone paying attention. 3. The free fertilizer factory. If you were a traveler walking past a Chinese rice paddy 1,000 years ago, you might look down and see the water covered in a thick, fuzzy, reddish-green blanket. It looked like the field was rotting. You would probably keep walking. You would be walking past the most brilliant piece of the entire system. That reddish-green carpet was a tiny floating fern called azolla. And azolla had a superpower that no other plant in the paddy could match. It could pull fertilizer directly out of thin air. Here is why that matters. Nitrogen is the single most critical ingredient for growing crops. Without it, plants cannot build proteins, cannot grow leaves, and cannot produce grain. It is the bottleneck of all agriculture. Today, the modern world manufactures nitrogen fertilizer through the Haber-Bosch process, an industrial procedure that requires enormous factories, extreme pressure, and temperatures hot enough to melt lead. This single process consumes roughly 1 to 2% of the entire world's energy supply every year. But azolla does it for free. Living inside the fern's leaves is a cyanobacterium, a microscopic organism that has formed a permanent partnership with the fern over tens of millions of years. This bacterium can grab nitrogen gas directly from the atmosphere and convert it into ammonium, pure, ready-to-use plant food. No factory, no energy cost, no human effort required. Chinese farmers figured this out centuries before anyone in the West understood what nitrogen even was. Historical texts like Qimin Yao Shu, The Essential Arts for the People, written around 540 AD, document how farmers actively cultivated azolla in their paddies. They did not just tolerate it, they managed it. The system was elegant. Azolla grows explosively fast, doubling its mass every 2 to 3 days. As the ferns spread, they formed a thick canopy over the water, blocking sunlight and preventing new weeds from germinating. A second layer of weed control on top of the flooding. Then, as the rice plants grew taller and shaded the water, the azolla died naturally, sank to the bottom, and decomposed. In the process, it released up to 40 kilograms of pure nitrogen per hectare directly into the mud, right where the rice roots could absorb it. Modern laboratory studies have discovered something even more extraordinary. Living azolla releases small peptides and flavonoids into the water that actively stimulate rice root growth. The fern was not just feeding the rice, it was communicating with it chemically, sending it growth signals. For For thousands of years, Chinese agriculture ran on this self-sustaining loop. Rice, water, fern. No chemical plants, no fossil fuels, just observation and patience. So the rice fed itself, and it fed the people. But by the turn of the first millennium, China was running into a different kind of wall. The population was growing, the demand for grain was accelerating, and the clock was the enemy, because traditional rice took 5 months to grow, leaving farmers with exactly one shot per year. One bad flood, one drought, one early frost, and an entire region starved. What happened next changed the trajectory of human civilization. 4. The 60-day miracle and the mountain carvers. The year is 1012 AD. The Song Dynasty rules China, and Emperor Zhenzong, a pragmatic ruler obsessed with agricultural productivity, hears rumors of a miraculous strain of rice from the kingdom of Champa, in what is now central Vietnam. Champa rice was a game-changer for one simple reason: speed. While traditional Chinese varieties needed 150 days to mature, Champa rice could go from seed to harvest in just 60 to 100 days. It was also drought-resistant, meaning it could survive in harsher conditions. Zhenzong did not wait. He dispatched envoys to Champa, acquired 30,000 bushels of seed, and personally ordered its distribution across the southern provinces. Government officials were instructed to teach farmers how to grow it. This was not passive trade. It was a state-sponsored agricultural revolution, one of the most deliberate acts of biological technology transfer in ancient history. The impact was immediate and staggering. For the first time, farmers could harvest their rice in late summer and still have enough growing season left to plant a second crop. In the warm southern provinces, some farmers achieved triple cropping, 3 full harvests from the same plot of land in a single year. Think about what that means in raw caloric terms. The same piece of land that once fed one family could now potentially feed 3. The surplus was not incremental, it was explosive. And the consequences rippled through every layer of Chinese society. Between roughly 1000 and 1100 AD, the population of China surged past 100 million. Millions of people were freed from farming. They became merchants, artisans, porcelain craftsmen, silk weavers, scholars, and engineers. This caloric surplus fueled what historians call the Song Dynasty Renaissance, a golden age that produced gunpowder, the magnetic compass, movable type printing, and the world's first government-issued paper currency. There is a connection here that rarely gets made in popular history. The Industrial Revolution in Britain is often credited as the great leap forward in human productivity. But the Song Dynasty economic boom, powered by a fast-growing Vietnamese rice strain, preceded it by 7 centuries. Per capita iron production in Song China exceeded that of Britain in 1700. The city of Kaifeng had over 1 million residents at a time when London had barely 20,000. But this very success created a new crisis. As the cities swelled, the lowland river valleys filled up. There was simply no more flat land to farm. The empire needed more food, and the only direction left to expand was straight up. Chinese farmers looked at steep mountain slopes, sometimes 45-degree inclines, and decided to reshape them by hand. They carved jagged mountainsides into thousands of level steps, creating the terraced paddies that still stagger visitors today in places like Yuanyang, Longji, and Honghe. These terraces are masterpieces of pre-industrial engineering, and the hydraulic design is the part that truly astonishes. Farmers preserved thick, old-growth forests at the very peaks of the mountains. These forests acted as giant sponges, trapping fog, mist, and rainfall. Gravity then pulled the water slowly out of the forest canopy, feeding it into the highest terrace. When that terrace filled, water spilled gently over the lip into the next one, and the next, cascading down the entire mountainside in a perfectly self-regulating system. No pumps, no pipes, no mechanical parts, just stone, mud, gravity, and extraordinary precision. The Hani people of Yunnan, who built many of these terraces, had a saying that captures their philosophy. The forest is the father, the water is the mother, and the terraced field is the child. Destroy the forest, and you kill the entire family. Rice had conquered the flatlands, the river deltas, and now the mountains. But as the empire expanded its military ambitions, engineers discovered that this humble grain could do something no one expected. It could be turned into a building material stronger than stone. 5. The breakfast that defied earthquakes. Fast forward to the Ming Dynasty, the 14th to 17th centuries. The empire faces constant pressure from Mongol and Manchu forces to the north, and the emperors order a massive reconstruction of the Great Wall. Thousands of laborers haul stones, bake bricks, and mix mortar. But alongside the stonemasons, there are teams of workers boiling enormous vats of sticky rice porridge. At first glance, it looks like they are cooking breakfast for the army. They are actually brewing one of the most advanced construction materials of the ancient world. When you cook glutinous rice, sticky rice, it releases a complex starch molecule called amylopectin. Ming builders discovered that when you mix this thick, gluey rice soup with slaked lime, calcium hydroxide, you create an organic-inorganic composite mortar with properties that standard lime mortar simply cannot match. At a microscopic level, the amylopectin weaves into the calcium carbonate crystals like a molecular net, creating an extraordinarily compact microstructure. Research teams from Zhejiang University, who analyzed surviving samples of this ancient mortar, found 3 distinct advantages over conventional cement. First, it was highly water-resistant, critical for a wall exposed to centuries of rain, snow, and freeze-thaw cycles. Second, the chemical reaction between the rice starch and the lime does not stop when the mortar dries. It continues for decades. The mortar literally gets stronger as it ages. And third, this is the most remarkable part, the rice starch gives the mortar a slight elasticity. Most ancient stone walls are rigid and brittle. When the ground shakes during an earthquake, the mortar cracks and the wall collapses. But sticky rice mortar can absorb and distribute seismic shock waves. It flexes instead of snapping. This is why vast stretches of the Great Wall, ancient pagodas, and imperial tombs from the Ming era are still standing today. Some after enduring earthquakes above 7.0 magnitude. The mortar held the bricks so tightly that even after 600 years, weeds still cannot push through the cracks. Here is a detail that adds another layer to this story. Sticky rice mortar was not cheap. Glutinous rice was a luxury food crop, and diverting it to construction meant someone was not eating it. Historical records suggest that during certain phases of wall construction, local populations resented the mortar program because it drove up rice prices. The wall was literally being glued together with food that could have fed families. This tension between monumental state projects and the daily survival of ordinary people is one of the recurring tragedies of Chinese imperial history, and it is a story that deserves its own video. Rice was not just the fuel that fed the workers who built the empire, it became the chemical skeleton that held the empire together. But after 9,000 years of shaping fields, carving mountains, and fortifying borders, this single crop did something even more profound than any of that. It reached inside the human mind and rewired how people think. 6. The rice theory, how a crop programmed a culture. Now we return to the Starbucks. For decades, psychologists noticed a consistent pattern. East Asian cultures tend to be more collectivistic, emphasizing group harmony, social obligation, and fitting in. Western cultures tend to be more individualistic, emphasizing personal freedom, self-expression, and standing out. The standard explanation was vague: Chinese philosophy or Confucian values. But nobody could explain why these philosophies emerged in the first place. In 2014, researcher Thomas Talhelm and his team proposed a startlingly concrete answer. They called it the rice theory of culture, and the argument is disarmingly simple. Think about what it takes to grow wheat. Wheat relies on rainfall. Rain falls on your field the same way it falls on your neighbor's. You can plow alone, plant alone, harvest alone. You can survive as an independent operator. You do not really need your village. Now think about rice. You cannot build a mountain terrace by yourself. You cannot construct an irrigation network alone. You cannot manage a shared water system without your neighbors. A rice paddy demands coordination at the village level. Once the water is flowing, the entire community faces what game theorists call a commons dilemma. Who gets how much water? In what order? If one farmer opens their sluice gate at the wrong time, they drain their neighbor's field. If they neglect their section of the dike, the whole village floods, and the raw labor demands are staggering. Paddy rice requires roughly twice the human labor per hectare compared to wheat. During the narrow windows for transplanting and harvesting, families had to pool their labor, rotating through each other's fields in strict sequence to prevent the crop from rotting in the ground. For thousands of years, this was the daily reality. Cooperate or starve, share the water or lose everything. Read the needs of your neighbors or destroy the system that keeps everyone alive. Talhelm's team tested this hypothesis with elegant experiments across China, comparing people from historically rice-farming southern provinces with people from historically wheat-farming northern provinces. The results were striking. In one test, they gave participants a sociogram task. Draw a circle representing yourself and draw circles representing your friends. People from wheat-farming cultures consistently drew themselves larger than their friends, a well-documented psychological trait called self-inflation. People from rice-farming cultures drew all the circles the same size. Then there was the Starbucks experiment. Researchers deliberately blocked aisles with chairs. In the north, customers moved the chair. They altered the environment to fit themselves. In the south, customers squeezed past. They altered themselves to fit the environment. Psychologists also found that people from rice-farming regions think more holistically. They tend to see the world as a web of relationships and context, while people from wheat-farming regions think more analytically, focusing on individual objects and actors. The ideas of duty, social order, and reading the room did not just come from Confucius. They were trained into the culture by a landscape where sharing water was the difference between survival and famine. And here is the part that should make you pause. These psychological differences persist today among young college students who have never touched a farm in their lives. The rice paddy is gone from their daily experience, but its logic is still running in the cultural operating system. 9,000 years of cooperation compressed into instinct. This does not mean one system is better than the other. Wheat cultures produced extraordinary innovation through individual ambition. Rice cultures produced extraordinary resilience through collective coordination. The point is that neither was an accident. Both were engineered, not by philosophers, not by governments, but by the crops themselves. The longest engineering project in history. We have traveled 9,000 years. We started with a nameless forager standing in a Yangtze River swamp, picking up a broken seed that nature had given up on. And we ended in a Starbucks in Shanghai, where the echo of that seed still dictates whether a person moves a chair or squeezes past it. In between, that single grain flooded fields to drown its enemies, pulled fertilizer from thin air, doubled an empire's harvest overnight, carved mountains into staircases, glued the Great Wall together through earthquakes, and quietly rewired the neural pathways of a civilization. We call rice a crop, but that does not come close to capturing what it actually is. Rice is the longest-running engineering project in human history. A 9,000-year collaboration between a plant and a species, each one shaping the other in ways neither could have predicted. The next time you look at a bowl of rice, remember, you are not just looking at food. You are looking at the blueprint of an empire. If this story changed the way you think about something you see every day, consider subscribing to Silk Road Annals. We decode the hidden mechanics behind the civilizations of the East, the buried science, the forgotten engineering, the secrets hiding in plain sight. I want to hear from you. What is the most underrated ancient technology that still shapes our world today? Drop your answer in the comments, and I will see you in the next chapter.